Washington Spirit are also included within this investigations and some of the results that they issued. We had talked about former head coach Kris Ward in the Spirit during the 2022 season, Lisa, because he was someone that was ultimately terminated and dismissed from his role. It was due to a very specific sequence of events. As we were talking about, there was a situation that took place within training grounds, and there were further investigations that were conducted around this. And since we're talking August 2022, and now we're here January 2023, the investigations ultimately sustained that he had engaged in verbal abuse and emotional conduct that includes specific racial stereotyping. So in August was fired as head coach due to this training ground incident. There was yelling, claims that there was yelling at players during out of frustration. He admitted that that's something that he went in an interview with The Athletic on. But this investigation and the league ultimately found that he did engage in overly aggressive behavior and harassment through negative racial stereotyping towards a player, and that is in violation of league policy. So, in terms of some of these corrective actions that have been placed from the league towards these individuals, he had already had termination from the Spirit. So, with these corrective actions, for Kris Ward specifically, they have deemed him ineligible for future employment. But there is a condition within that if they were to seek employment within NWSL, it has to be with approval of the NWSL commissioner, and there is additional training that would have to come into play, and there will have to be, again, an admittance of wrongdoing and an acceptance of personal responsibility within that. And I'm like reading the updates between all of these individuals and the corrective actions issued to them from these two particular clubs. It just sort of, I appreciated the consequence essentially that was issued, because we're talking about medical things, very, very layered and complex, like medical laws and practices that we're talking about with the Portland Thorns investigation. And then when you look at the Washington Spirit, it's important to note that it's a different situation because it's issues of racism that are involved within this particular situation. And I think it's important to always note that there are unfortunately things that we've had to cover over the last couple seasons of this league when it has come to all of these varying investigations, whether it was U.S. Soccer's independent investigation with Sally Q. Yates, or the joint team investigation between the PA and the league, or now these sort of individual, unique, one-off kind of specific third-party investigations into clubs and allegations there. No matter what they are, there have been things that have been investigated within all of these reports that can impact all players at any level within this league.
Totally.
And we've talked about things like whether sexual harassment or misconduct. We're talking about things like medical malpractice. But when it comes to racism, that is actually something that cannot be experienced by all players in this league. And so because of that, it should absolutely be taken care of and treated with the utmost urgency and importance as something like sexual misconduct allegations, or something like medical malpractice allegations. Racism is not something that should just sort of be like, oh wow, isn't that a terrible thing that happened, and just sort of move on. What is going to happen from this point? So while I'm it's good to see that the league issued a pretty serious corrective action to this particular individual, and my hope is that from there, that the players in the Washington Spirit and across the league continue to get support when it comes to issues of dealing with things like racism or racial profiling or things like that within their playing environments. So I think that's also something that we need to continue to keep an eye on, and not just sort of be like, okay, well, this thing happened and they issued a corrective action, and now let's continue to move forward. Like, no, like that's something that you always have to keep maintaining an eye on, and hopefully try to eradicate or eliminate, like
Yeah,
within the league,
it's
players who suffer
horrible
from
that it's horrible that it's not something that you can just say like, okay, no, we're done with that. It's forever ongoing, and it needs to be stayed on top of, that it doesn't continue to happen moving forward, whether it's with Kris Ward or anyone else. And I think that one step that has been taken forward in the last year or 2 years within the NWSL is taking those allegations seriously and understanding that they need to be investigated, and that there needs to be action that is taken following those investigations. With the results of the investigation into Kris Ward and these actions that happened in August of last year, we talked about it at the time because this was an open story as to why Kris Ward was relieved of his duties as head coach earlier in the year, and kind of how that unfolded. He then went on to have an interview with The Athletic where he talked about the situation at practice and that he admitted to yelling at a player in frustration. And then following that, we saw a Washington Spirit team statement from captain or co-captain of the team, Andy Sullivan, saying that the team was angered by Kris Ward's answers in the interview, saying that, yes, there's two sides to every story, but that is not the case in this scenario. They know that stating that the interview that Kris Ward did was completely inaccurate recollection of a serious situation, and that the apology that Kris Ward was offered to the team, there was a misalignment in his words and his actions towards the team. So I think it's interesting because that part of it coming out in late August was public. That was put out on social media. The interview was put out by The Athletic, and a lot of this was in the public eye. And ultimately, the league had to go through an investigation about what happened, and they found that the allegations against Ward were sustained. And as you said, I think that aggressive behavior, the harassment, and most importantly, the negative racial stereotyping towards a player is completely in violation. But the fact that he was already fired in August it just adds like a different layer of difficulty, right, as to this
yeah
point, because he's not still employed by the league or by the club or anyone at this point. So then
yeah
it limits the league and this Washington
yeah
Spirit, their course of actions as to what they can do against this person because they're no longer
yeah
involved. And that's
they're all the corrective action just sort of seems like they're ultimately upholding
right,
the consequence that was already issued by the club
right.
specifically, while just sort of like tacking on that added component of like, you're, because of this, you're ineligible, and even if there's a possibility of your reentry into the league in any capacity, there has to be an admittance of wrongdoing on your part
Mhm.
in this specific situation. So I think to sort of maybe transition from this and continue to talk about more news that's happening in the league. Um, I think there's also an interesting reaction to this type of stuff when it comes out, and I think you and I saw it when the league released this, that sometimes there has been this added reaction from the public where it's like, oh no, here we go again, kind of energy around the league and issuing these things. And I just want to remind folks who are listening to this or watching us on this, is that this league is trying its very best to sort of take these next steps into its next era. And
Mhm.
for a long time, a whole decade, in fact, this league existed without so many of the very important things that need to exist within any organization,
Any
for
working
employees
environment,
for
any working
employees to
environment.
thrive. Yeah, like things like, this league didn't have, had clubs that didn't have like HR departments. There was no anti-harassment policy in place. There were no appropriate channels for players to go and report complaints or anything like that. Those things did not exist for nearly an entire decade, within the league and within some of their clubs specifically. So what's happening now is, now that there are resources, now that there's a literal CBA for players that exists now, um, there's a player union that's in place that wasn't necessarily always a part of the league in its first 10 years. And now there's those anti-harassment policies, and now there are actual channels and avenues for players to report concerns or misconducts and allegations. Because those things exist now, there's actually going to be some more of this, I think, moving forward. Because these things are in place, they need to allow the opportunity to produce the eventual change that the league and the players actually want to see. So, is it exhausting to read something like these kind of constantly, or from our perspective, kind of cover it? Yeah, of course. I'm not going to say that it's
But
not,
but
but
we're
it's
also not the ones going through it, and
we're
we're not
also
the
not the ones going through it. And
gotta
it's
be
also
exhausting for the
really
players.
it's also just really an important part of this next history of this league, because we need to ensure that we're like covering it, talking about it, and documenting it, and making sure that the league does kind of really stay within that third step, right? We've heard so much about this three-pronged approach to the NWSL ecosystem in this next era for the league. The first of that was going through these investigations, seeking out the truth. The commissioner are talking about how they're really kind of in this second step of issuing corrective actions, but that second step kind of goes hand in hand with that third step, which is ultimately systemic reform. And systemic reform is not something that is going to happen overnight. That's not how it works, especially when we're looking at sort of the past decade of things. There's like a decade of things that have to be undone and sort of rectified and clarified, and continue to be worked on. So I feel everyone, when they maybe sort of feel a layer of exhaustion, and maybe they're like, ugh, this is the part that's really, really tough. And I can assure you that if it's tough to read or go through, I can only imagine that it's even harder for players who have to live it every day and go through it. So while we're here to talk about the soccer and cover the game and all that, we're also here to cover the players. And we're really looking forward to continue trying to balance those two things together.